Thank you. I have the last word. In the year 1980, I had the great good fortune to be elected to a fellowship of All Souls College, Oxford. All Souls is a very strange college. It's austere, beautiful, 18th century for the most part, and it has the great advantage that it has no students, only fellows. Wonderful arrangement, the perfect academic institution. Anyway, on my first day, I was going down to breakfast. I was 20 years old. I go into this common room, beautiful common room with oak paneling, oak table, mahogany paneling, I mean, highly polished. Everything was served in silver. So you've got your Weetabix in silver bowls. You've got your cornflakes in silver bowls. You've got your bacon and egg in silver platters. And there were two people sitting at this table, both of them wearing black suits, both of them wearing white shirts. One was Rodney Needham, professor of anthropology, and the other was Brian Wilson, professor of sociology. For 10 minutes, nothing was said. Complete silence. I sit there thinking, my God, I'm in a madhouse. Not a word spoken. Then, after 10 minutes, Rodney Needham says, I have decided to commit suicide. Another long silence, perhaps 10 more minutes of silence. And then Rodney Needham Brian Wilson gets up to leave and says, well, it is an option available to us all, and walks out of the room. Now, Brian may have thought that suicide was an option available to us all, but he didn't think that secularization was an option available to us all. He thought it was something that was inevitable, inescapable, and was going to be imposed upon us whether we liked it or not. Secularization was absolutely non-negotiable in his view of the world. And in that, he was reflecting a very common view, I think, perhaps the predominant view amongst the European intelligentsia, at least, from at least the 18th century. Voltaire said that religion would be dead within 50 years. Bertrand Russell's father spent a lot of his life calculating the exact moment in which religion could be declared dead. Nietzsche, at least, had the decency to say religion was already dead. God is dead. We have killed him, and he will never return. And I think that there was a general consensus that religion was dead, and that at the very most, it was something that was private, personal, that it had retreated from the public sphere, and it was not something that was really going to shape history again. Europe had led the way, everybody else would follow, and that was the consensus. And that was very much the consensus when I was at Oxford in the 1980s and 90s, let's say, sitting, drinking the too much claret in All Souls and the rest of it. You had Francis Fukuyama saying in the end of history that the end of history was not only the triumph of liberalism, it was the triumph of secularism. You have Henry Kissinger in his great, wonderful 900-page book on diplomacy, does not have a single mention of religion in the index. Look at the four major publications, journal publications in the United States between 1980 and 1999 on foreign policy. There's about half a dozen, if that, articles which mention religion at all. This is a purely secularized view of the world, and I'm very ashamed to say that The Economist in our Millennium issue had an obituary of God. Very clever clogs, very Economist, and I think, again, that was the dominant wisdom of the time. I think it was wrong. It was wrong when I was sitting in 1980 listening to this talk of imminent suicide. He didn't commit suicide, by the way, if anybody cared. By 1967, I think you have a major turning point in the 6 Days War, which really sets off a stream of radical Islam in the Arab world. It's when radicalism ceases to be secular nationalism and becomes radical Islam. You have a growth of religious fundamentalism in Israel at the same time. By the end of the 1970s, you have Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority. You have a very aggressively proselytizing Catholic Pope. You have Jimmy Carter, for what it's worth, as the first born-again president for many years, you have a tide that has turned, I think, and it continues to turn in the 20th century, in the 21st century, in a major way. Religion, far from being something that's private, far from something being personal, becomes something that is shaping public events in an absolutely central way. It does that on September the 11th, the great turning point of the 21st century, the founding event of our time in many ways, is a purely religious, fanatical event. The people who did that were motivated by faith. They shave off their hair, they ritually bathe before they do it shouting Allah Akbar and the rest of it, and they do it to make an existential point, a religious point. We try, the West tries, to produce a secular solution to that. It tries to create a secular, democratic regime in the heart of the Arab world because it thinks that will change the direction of history back towards what we think it should be, which is a secular direction of history. And that fails absolutely fundamentally. And you have a series of religious wars. You have the rise of ISIL, whatever you want to call it, which is, with its notion of the caliphate, with its Baghdadi, is himself the sort of the chief warrior, religious warrior. He's the head of the faith. You have a complete religious shaping of public events. That continues to happen right around the world. We see it over and over again in Africa. We saw it in Kenya, 148 people slaughtered by Muslim extremists, radicals, and many of them singled out, I mean, most of them singled out precisely because they were Christians. It was an act of religious aggression. You have Boko Haram in Nigeria, again, doing what it's doing for religious reasons. And you have, at the same time, a surging, expanding evangelical faith in that part of the world, trying to resist what's going on in terms of Muslim aggression, but also trying to win converts. There is a genuine tension, religious tension, behind what's going on there. If we think of the two sort of headquarters, the two bastions of secularization, the two countries that did most in the 20th century to try and advance the causes of secularization, they're Russia and China. Russia, I don't know what you say about Russia. I haven't looked into Putin's soul. I think you probably have to look for a long time to find very much there. But Putin is definitely somebody who uses the language and symbolism of religion, who has a relationship with the Orthodox Church. And in that weird stew of beliefs that you have in Russia at the moment, religion is part of it. I wrote an article in the Sunday Times which was at some point critical of Putin. I got a huge amount of hate mail. And a lot of it was about how dare you secular, liberal, elitists denounce us because what have you produced? Gays, pornography. And they sent me a great deal of gay pornography, and I wondered how did they have all this gay pornography if they thought it was such a bad thing, but still that's an irrelevancy. China, again, an even more, in many ways, country even more committed, even more absolute and extreme in its attempt to eradicate religion, is now an area which is seeing a conflict. There's a scramble for China between Christianity and Islam. There are, I don't know, religious numbers are very hard to gauge, 60, 70 million evangelicals, 12 million Catholics, 20 million Muslims in China. Very, very hard to gauge the exact numbers, but probably more committed Christians, committed Muslims together than there are committed members of the Communist Party. And those numbers are very likely to grow. So it looks to me as if China by 2050 could be the world's biggest Christian country and the world's biggest Muslim country. And I think that will shape their politics and conflicts within that country in very profound ways. Or look at some other bastions of secularization. Turkey, Ataturk. What do we have now? We have Erdogan, we have rule by a party which is basically an Islamic and an increasingly Islamic party. Or look at India, another, look at Nehru, look at the notion of modernization and secularization, absolutely central to Nehru's vision of the world. And now in Modi, you have somebody who's a very convinced Hindu who grew up in some, I think, rather bizarre sort of semi-militarized sect, who's taken a vow of chastity, who's very Hindu in his view of the world, and has a lot of supporters who are also equally committed. A very, very strange break in the secular history of India. Europe, well, obviously, you know, the cradle of secularization theory, the cradle of secularization. But again, and Alistair Campbell, who was the press officer of Tony Blair, once said rather famously, "We don't do God." But Europe, even Europe, is being forced to do God a bit more than it was, primarily because of the rise of Islam, primarily because you have people from Bradford, people from Brussels going to serve in ISIL, primarily because you have all sorts of civil problems being created by committed Muslim populations that don't want to act according to the principles that most people in Britain would regard as sensible. We have Rochdale, we have arguments about forced marriage. Cultural conflicts over these things are becoming central in Europe. Culture wars are becoming central in Europe in a way in which perhaps they're not quite as central in the United States as they used to be. And the rise of Islam and the assertiveness of Islam is asking many people who belong to the secular majority just how much their civilization was shaped by and owes to Christianity. People are becoming more sensitive to the influence of Christianity on their lives and on their worldviews. So religious issues, cultural issues are absolutely now at the center of politics in the way that they just haven't been for decades and decades before. So the big problem, I think, with secularization theory, and I appreciate the numbers that were presented before, but part of the secularization theory, I think, is a notion of retreat from public life, retreat from shaping history. That's not happening. Religion is shaping history in an absolutely fundamental way. The second problem with secularization theory, I think, is the fact that the wrong sorts of religions are succeeding, are growing, are shaping history. I think basically secularization theory said that insofar as religion survives, it survives in the form of Unitarianism, let's say. Unitarians, as we all know, believe that there is one God, if that. It survives in the form of sort of doubting Catholicism, Graham Greene sorts of characters, or sort of hand-wringing Anglicanism. That's not how it survives. It survives in the form of hot religion. It survives in the form of very, very committed religion, religion that is at tension with secular society in all sorts of fundamental ways. That is true of Islam. It's also true of Protestantism, particularly Pentecostalism. The fastest growing religion in the world is Pentecostal religion, Pentecostal faith. I spent a few days looking at this in Guatemala City, and I would suggest that anybody who really believes the secularization thesis just spend some time in Guatemala City. Try and sleep in Guatemala City. It's very hard to get to sleep at night because they're all discoing like mad, very, very loud discos, and then suddenly at 6 o'clock in the morning, the Pentecostal churches take over from the discos, and you hear that racket going on and on and on. There's a constant either a party or penitence, but certainly religion is absolutely at the heart of what's going on in that country, in that part of the world. So the wrong sorts of religion are surviving, thriving, prospering, but also the wrong sorts of people, from the point of view of Brian Wilson, the wrong sorts of people are turning to religion. The people who are turning to religion should be, in the secularization view, stump-toothed imbeciles from the swamps of Mississippi or the backwoods of Gujarat or something. They should be very, very backward people. They're not backward people. In the main, they are the very opposite of backward people. So if you look in Turkey, the very people that Ataturk thought would be leading modernization, progressive, educated business people, are now the people voting for Erdogan. Look at Modi. An even better example is Modi. The sort of people who are driving Modi's politics are business people, rising small business people, educated, aspirational small business people. Or look at Guatemala, look at Latin America. I mean, Weber's thesis has never been better demonstrated and proved than it is in Latin America at the moment. The people who are turning to Pentecostalism, to Protestantism, are people who are self-improving, who are worried about losing their way in a confusing, difficult society, who regard religion as a form of upward social mobility as well as a form of spiritual inspiration. These are Weber's people all across Latin America, and you can see a lot of them in Africa as well. So the wrong sort of religion, the wrong sort of people is shaping history in very fundamental ways. But secularization theory is even wronger than that. And that's very wrong already. Because the forces that are driving secularization, that are driving the survival and revival of religion, are the very forces that were supposed to kill it. They're the forces of choice. They're the forces of competition. And they're their forces of technology. What religion has done is managed to co-opt these forces. Particularly, let's start with technology. What religion has seen is that technology isn't its enemy, it's its friend. I remember in the late 1970s going to the Crystal Cathedral in California, Robert Schuller, who died last week, his cathedral. And I came from Britain. I thought, well, churches were these places where you had little old ladies playing the organ, and there weren't many people there, and it was all very old-fashioned. It was all very, very unmodern. And there you see something like Schuller using all the forces of modern technology, wonderful organs, wonderful productions. It was a Hollywood production to project the word. And what you're seeing is more and more people around the world in the megachurches and in various other religious organizations and in the mega mosques using technology to get their word across. I remember going to something called the Dragon Mall in Dubai, worth visiting if you ever go there. It's a huge mall set up by basically mostly Chinese traders. And I went there, and then there was a whole section, a huge section of this mall. There was there's an acre of toilets in one area, an acre of baths in another area. Here there were an acre of electronic Qurans. They're basically Qurans, which all these traders, who happen to be Chinese actually, were selling to the local Muslim population. You could press various words on it, and it would speak the words. Or you could press various bits. You could glide your hand along a page, and it would read out the Quran to you. So they were just people. It was a wonderful example of globalization. Chinese people having made these Qurans in probably unspeakable factories in China, selling them and getting the message across using the modern techniques of technology. And I think that once you have choice, if people choose their religion, they're going to be more committed to embracing it, more committed to spreading it than if they simply inherit it. And if there's competition, as we heard from Adam Smith's example, if there's competition between various churches, the more efficient providers of services will survive and will prosper. So all of the things at the heart of modernity, technology, choice, competition, that were supposed to kill religion, have actually helped it to thrive. So I think that Brian Wilson, the rest of the intelligentsia, were basically asking themselves the wrong question. The question that they were obsessed by was, how do we live in a world where God is dead, without religion? And some people, Marxists and left-wingers, thought, well, at least that's God. Thank God, that's all finished with. We live in that world and we're happy. Some people, like Kierkegaard, think, oh, God, we have to agonize forever about this terrible thing. Some people, like Jean-Paul Sartre, try and have it both ways when he said, God is dead, the bastard. But nevertheless, that's the wrong question in my mind. The right question is not, how do we live in a world without God, but how do we live in a world where there is a God, where there is a thriving religion, and where there is modernity? How do we live in a world where we have both of these things at the same time? Because they can be a terrifying combination. In Pakistan has the nuclear bomb. Many people in Pakistan would like to liberate that bomb from the state and use it for various nefarious ends. There are all sorts of ways in which the combination of God and modernity can be terrifying. We saw some of it in September the 11th. We might see something worse in the future. So that means to me that we have to think much more carefully than we have about two things. We have to recalibrate our thinking about foreign policy. Our thinking about foreign policy has been absolutely fundamentally secular. Our thinking has been completely locked in a sort of Westphalian box, essentially. And in the foreign services, a taste, an interest, some sort of belief in religion, a taste for religion, is basically like a taste for bondage. I mean, you can have it if you want, as long as you do it in private and don't mention it and don't let it in any way influence your work. It's one of the most secular parts of this state machinery. But in fact, that hampers us hugely and has hampered us hugely in understanding what's going on in the world. When certain people in Iran in the late 1970s started talking about the rise of religious radicalism there and started saying that perhaps the Shah wasn't very secure, the CIA said this is nonsense. In fact, they said this is sociological nonsense. And as we know, there is nothing worse than sociological nonsense. You had people in the State Department saying, the Hezbollah, how do we explain that? Is it socialist? Ignoring the fact that the name Hezbollah means party of God, which is a bit of a clue, but not enough for the State Department. We even had, after the gigantic wake-up call of September the 11th, a continuation of those fundamentally secular attitudes in the State Department. So there was a very amusing set of articles in Congressional Quarterly in 2005 when somebody actually went round asking people in the security apparatus in the United States, in Washington, the distinction between Sunni and Shia. And the guy in charge of the FBI counterterrorism thing said, yeah, it's an important one. Then they asked him to identify Iran, and he identified it as a Sunni state. It's 50-50, I suppose. But so that sort of ignorance has been very important. But also I think there's something more, even more fundamental than that. If you look at the neoconservative project, which we're all taught to demonize, that was a fundamentally secular project. That was basically the idea that we could set up a liberal, secular democracy in the heart of the Arab world. And it was driven by a sort of secular sort of fanaticism, I think. And it took a very, very long time to adjust to the fact that that view of the world was completely wrong. So we need to adjust our foreign policy thinking fundamentally to take into account, I'm sorry, I'm going on, the revival of God. And finally, I think we need to think much more deeply about the proper relationship between power and religion. And we need to recapture some of the sort of intellectual inspiration of the Enlightenment. We need to go back and think about Locke and read Locke. We need to go back and think about Hume. We need to go back and think about Adam Smith, because what they're saying is very fundamental about the proper relationship between God and the state. And above all, we need to go back to the Founding Fathers and look at what they were saying, because the Founding Fathers are absolutely fascinating on this subject. And they have a huge lesson, not just for us now, but for the rest of the world, because what they said is that religion is an important thing. It's a very vital part of life. It's a source of social capital. It's a source of civic virtue. But it's also something that's very dangerous. It's very dangerous if you mix religion and power together. You get something very dangerous, very, very hard to control. They looked and thought about the 30 Years' War in the way that we used to look and think about the Second World War. It was something very close to them, very much in their imagination. They didn't want this to be repeated. And you can find endless phrases. John Adams talking about sacerdotal tyrants. Jefferson talking about the loathsome combination of church and state. The idea at the heart of what they did was to try and break what they called the juncto, this alliance between church and state. And they did this by introducing one of the great paradigm changes in human history, which is to say, let's have religion, let's have the state, but let's separate the two of them. Let's create a real marketplace in religion. Let's disestablish the church. Let the church or churches compete for customers. Let the state do what it does, but separate them as much as possible. Build a wall between the two. And that, I think, created a world in which religion could prosper and in which the secular and the state could prosper. It created a world of pluralism, which America has lived in for a century, 2 centuries, which Europe has not lived in, and which the Muslim world has definitely not lived in, and which has a huge, huge lesson for the rest of the world. I think there was this notion of secularists that the problem of religion would die a natural death. People would stop believing. There was this notion of the people of faith that the problem of doubt would die. All we have to do is preach enough. Neither of those two things is right. We're going to have a world in which religion exists. We're going to have a world in which secularists exist. We have to respect both of their interests. And in order to do that, we have to embrace pluralism. And I think the country that provides a model for the rest of the world, I don't agree with what Peter was saying. I do think that it is a model which we ought to be spreading towards the rest of the world, because it's the only way in which this sort of pluralism, a pluralism which recognizes the rights of religious people and the rights of non-religious people, and allows a plurality of different views of the world to coexist. To do that, you have to change the balance of power between church and state. You have to remove the power of religious people to dictate, but you also have to remove the power of secular people to outlaw religion. You have to create a society at which secularism, in which pluralism is the ruling political philosophy, not just an analytical tool, but a political philosophy that can provide a world in which we can all live in peace again. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
perhaps. But all I'm saying is there was much greater uncertainty. It was a great period of opportunity for serious discussion. There were serious discussions. The best discussions were being conducted in the television community. And they were not given sufficient attention. They were overruled, and I don't care about Republican, neocon, Democrat, but that's not the issue here. There was a political process that basically was driven by other issues than serious discussions of religion. There were serious discussions of religion. There were secularists. There's a very substantial Jewish, Orthodox Jewish community that informed, it's active in the State Department and believes very powerfully. There's a strong Catholic community, and there are evangelicals. They're somewhat newer, but all of this makes for a very, very interesting dynamic. The discussions, the talk, the worldview have been taking religion seriously. The political process is not.
Okay.
Because
one more quick point, and then I can come back.
I'm just going to elaborate on what Bob said, speaking more from the Pentagon and the intelligence community, my world as opposed to the State Department. Around the Pentagon community, we refer to CIA as referring to Christians in action. That's the internal joke. The number of Protestants and evangelicals in the Central Intelligence Agency far exceeds that within the general American population. Within the Pentagon world, again, within the U.S. military, it exceeds the norm of an American society at large. It's a much more religious organization, much more religious institution. And the discussion I was involved in, and I still work for the U.S. Army, religion taken very, very seriously, very seriously, and the ignorance of Sunni and Shia, and that they can go into great, great depth within these areas. But the problem is the possibility of distinction between military arm and the political arm. And I think that dovetails on what Bob was saying, which is the Pentagon intelligence community gets sidelined in policy making because the strength and relationship between the Department of State, the National Security Council, and the politics that comes in when the executive and legislative branch goes on. So I know in my world there's a lot of frustration that we wrote these analyses, we put this stuff forward, we debated this, and in the end it makes us look like we're ignorant. But in fact, we were involved in a lot of very in-depth discussion about the nature of religion, the role it plays in mobilizing terrorists, everything. Just stuff like
No retraction. I would say it's important to make a distinction between Christians in action, between being religious and appreciating the role of religion in public policy. I'm not arguing that we should stuff the State Department with religious fanatics. I don't care what people believe in their private lives. All I'm saying is that they should, as part of their mental apparatus, give some sort of much more serious consideration to religion. So I think that's a distinction that's important indeed.
we had now unclassified. In 1981, Central Intelligence Agency smuggled the Quran into the Soviet Union, Central Asia, in an attempt to bring about conversion from atheism to religion to destabilize the Soviet Union. That's now a top-secret program has been classified. They utilize religion as a tool of foreign policy making to subvert the Soviet government. We do it all over the world. So it's not just that they're Christian. They understand the power of religious belief and faith to bring about the political and military objectives they want to achieve.
Well, I mean, the counterexample to that would be the CIA's failure to understand what was going on in Iran, the complete underestimating of the importance of faith and the sense that the Shah actually represented a sort of secular majority that would probably hold. They did one thing. They smuggled a few Bibles. They lost Iran. Well, I don't know. In terms of, I could quote lots of other examples. You've got Madeleine Albright saying that she's never been in a more secular world than in the world of the foreign policy establishment, that she never had a serious conversation with religion or its role in public life with any official that she was involved in. I could quote Thomas Farr from the state, and who is running the Office of Religious Freedom in the State Department, saying that it was the most secular institution he'd ever operated in, perhaps even more secular than Georgetown University. And as I say, this research that Congressional Quarterly did was, fairly thorough empirical research. They went round asking people in positions of authority in the intelligence apparatus of Washington some fairly simple, basic religious questions. And this was what, four years after September 11th, and they got it wrong. I mean, they got it more wrong than you would if you were just guessing blind, actually. They must have known something and been given the wrong answers. So, I mean, obviously I've painted with a very broad brush, but I think that nevertheless, I think, and even with what George was saying about Iraq, I think that there was a real failure to understand quite how divided the country was by creed, how much these people hated each other, how much they couldn't get on. There was this Enlightenment notion of let them discover pluralism and the separation of church and state and the rest of it. But I think there was just a real failure to understand tribal religious loyalties, in the way that you might do if you spent more time going to watch football matches or something like that, rather than reading national interest or the American interest, sorry. Thank you. Oh, God, sorry. I walk off with it.